sheet where you've written in question, please raise your hand so our volunteers can retrieve questions from you. I was told that as moderator I could irrigate the option to ask the first question, so I'll do that before turning to questions that people have. And my question actually is for John. It's strange for a philosophy professor to object that we're being too philosophical, but in a sense, I wonder about the philosophical character of the debate that we're having. I don't remember ever discussing the Kalam cosmological argument or the concept of infinity in Sunday school. And it seems to me more generally that oftentimes these arguments, and most of them are quite ancient, are intellectually stimulating, but they don't relate very closely at all to the personal belief of theists. And so I'm wondering, I'm hoping John can respond to the question about, well, what is the proper place between this sort of intellectual debate and the genuine personal beliefs of theists?
I think a couple things. First of all, one of the things I wanted to do tonight was to focus on the question of does God exist? And I didn't want to get too sidetracked by other things. For instance, I didn't want to get in an argument with Marvin about the validity of the Bible or those kinds of things. And so I wanted to really focus on this. As far as being philosophical and the Kalam argument and things like that, I would say this: that the creation of the universe would be the largest and most significant miracle that God ever did. And when you think of it that way, when you think of a miracle of that magnitude, all the other miracles that actually Scripture talks about become possible. God intervening in human history and being a personal being. And so I think that when we start at the beginning and we realize that God is the things I talked about because of the Kalam argument, including personal, which means that He's interested in our lives and He wants a loving relationship with us. I think that follows eventually, not directly. That the Kalam argument becomes something significant to our life and our theology and what we think of the kind of God that is.
The next is a question for Marvin. How does a non-believer explain pain, sorrow, love, and joy, these deep matters of the human soul?
Well, since I don't believe in the human soul, I just believe there are standard emotions. Believe it or not, you can measure some of those emotions. You can measure pain, just questions, or almost any of them, covering people with electrodes, putting them through tests. I think it has absolutely nothing to do with the soul. If I don't believe in God or the devil or heaven or hell, you can imagine what I think about the soul. So I think pain hurts. We can alleviate it with pain relievers. I think sorrow, you get a divorce, the average time to recover is 2 years, either before the divorce or after. So we know a lot of things about them, especially people that deal with those type of emotions. But how do they relate to the soul? They don't. There is no soul.
The next question is for John, and it has to do with the problem of evil. The question is this: how do you account for non-human created suffering, such as disease, besides considerations of providing compassion to sufferers?
I think, and that's a great question. The way that we account for it is there's a couple ways, and they're really both theological. There might be even more ways than these two. But when God created, my understanding of God and who He is and how He's revealed Himself to us, when God created us in His image, He gave us the option of being morally good or morally evil, of loving Him or not loving Him. And we chose to not love Him, at least in some respects. That there was a consequence, not just a spiritual consequence, but also a physical consequence with the universe that God created. In addition, you might ask the question, what was the purpose of God's creation? And if the purpose of God's creation was temporary, that it would wear down, that things like earthquakes and disease and things would eventually work themselves in, so that eventually He would create a new heaven and a new earth, which is what the Scriptures talk about in Revelation 22, that we would expect to see some of those things. And that the suffering that we experience, whether it is moral suffering or the result of moral actions, or whether it is the result of natural things, will pale in comparison to what God will give us eventually in the new heaven and the new earth. Thank you.
So the next question is for Marvin. The question is this. I know you've explained when God doesn't answer prayers. How can you explain when God does answer prayers? And how would you explain miracles?
Airplane crashed in South America a week ago. 119 people died and one person survived. Does that mean that the other 119 were unworthy and somebody just happened to pray for the 120th? The incidence of death from pancreatic cancer is 90%. It's one of the deadliest diseases there is. It used to be 5% survival rate. Now it's a 10% survival rate and a 90% death rate. Does that mean the 90% of the people that died from pancreatic cancer weren't prayed for and only the 10% that survived? If you pray for somebody that has testicular cancer, that used to be a deadly disease, we flip the results upside down. It used to be 90% death, 10% survive. Now it's just exactly the opposite. 10% death, 90% survive. That has nothing to do with prayer. If you pray for somebody with testicular cancer, there's an excellent chance that they're going to survive. Sometimes prayer is there when people survive. Sometimes it is not. Nothing fails like prayer. Thank you.
And the next question is for John. When competing interests petition God for help with their cause, for example, Iraqis and Iranians, or the Buffs versus the Cornhuskers, how does God decide whom to help?
I would say two things to that. Number one, the presumption is that I am smart enough to know the mind of God, which I am flattered. Thank you very much. However, I am not that smart. I think that one thing we need to understand about prayer, by the way, just to point out, Marvin didn't actually answer the question that was asked of him about when God does answer prayer. But one thing we need to understand that prayer and petitioning God is, in the theology of the Christian, is not as much about getting Him to do what we want, as much as it is about understanding that we are in submission and relationship to Him. And so He decides how He decides. I don't know what God's desire is. My assumption is that He decides based on the greater good for His glory and His kingdom. And I don't know what that would be. God does know what that would be. So that's where faith comes in. But faith is not a blind leap. It is based on the understanding and the faith that we have and the trust that we have in God based on His past performance and how He has been there for humans in the past. And so I think that to know the mind of God is it's presumptuous to suggest that any human finite being could know an infinite being's mind.